It is the height of the last glacial maximum, roughly 15,000 years ago, in a limestone cave tucked into a valley in what we now call southern France. Outside, the wind is a jagged blade of ice, screaming across a landscape dominated by mammoths and reindeer. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, rendered fat, and the damp, earthy musk of huddling bodies. A girl, perhaps 16 years old, sits near the edge of the firelight. She is wrapped in a heavy cloak of bison hide, stitched together with bone needles and sinew. Suddenly, she feels a strange, warm dampness. She looks down and sees a dark, blooming stain on the fur beneath her. In this world, blood is the most dangerous substance in existence. It is the smell that draws the cave lion. It is the sign of a spear gone wrong or a predator's successful hunt. To see blood is to know that death is nearby. But for this girl, the paradox is total. She isn't dying. She isn't even hurt. She is experiencing the single most universal biological event in the history of our species, and yet, she is standing on the edge of a mystery that modern science is only now beginning to fully map. You might assume this girl was terrified, or that her community viewed her as a walking disaster, but that's because we tend to project our own modern anxieties onto a past that was far more pragmatic than we give it credit for. The first time a prehistoric woman dealt with her period, she wasn't just managing a biological function. She was navigating a complex calculation of energy, survival, and social status. It is a story that has been almost entirely erased from our history books, mostly because the people who wrote those books were men who found the subject either trivial or terrifying. But when we look at the hard data, the isotopic signatures in ancient teeth, the microscopic residue on stone tools, and the metabolic realities of the human body, a very different picture emerges. This isn't just a story about hygiene. It's a story about how the human body decides when it is safe to create life, and how our ancestors managed that transition in a world that offered no instructions, no products, and no margin for error. But if you think this 16-year-old girl was experiencing the same monthly cycle you or your partner might experience today, you are actually looking at the biology entirely backwards. In the modern, well-fed West, the average age for a girl's first period, or menarche, is between 12 and 13 years old. We view this as the natural baseline. However, if we look at the evolutionary record, our modern experience is actually the radical outlier. For the vast majority of human history, the first period didn't happen at 12. It didn't even happen at 14. According to the groundbreaking work of researcher Rose Frisch in the 1970s, specifically her study, Menstrual Cycles, Fatness as a Determinant of Minimum Weight for Height, the human body operates on a strict fuel gauge system. Frisch discovered that a girl generally needs to reach a threshold of roughly 17% body fat before the brain's hypothalamus will even consider triggering the hormonal cascade of puberty. In a prehistoric environment, or even in traditional hunter-gatherer societies studied in the 20th century, reaching that 17% threshold was an immense physical challenge. Anthropologist Nancy Howell's extensive work with the Kung people of the Kalahari Desert showed that for girls living a traditional, high-activity, lean diet lifestyle, the first period typically didn't arrive until age 16 or 17. This delay wasn't a biological failure, it was a survival mechanism. If your body is barely finding enough calories to keep your own heart beating and your own brain functioning, it would be evolutionary suicide to start a process that demands the massive caloric surplus required for pregnancy and lactation. The girl in the cave wasn't a child when she saw that first drop of blood. She was a young woman whose body had finally, after years of searching and scavenging, accumulated enough of a biological savings account to take a risk on the future. However, just because her body finally gave the green light doesn't mean she spent the rest of her life dealing with a monthly cycle. In fact, the idea of the monthly period is largely a modern luxury. We often imagine ancient women huddled in menstrual huts every 28 days, but the math simply doesn't support that. Consider the research of Beverly Strassman, an evolutionary anthropologist who spent years living with the Dogon people of Mali. Her study, published in the journal Behavioral Ecology and Sociobiology, provided a startling reality check. In societies without modern contraception, women spend the vast majority of their reproductive years either pregnant or breastfeeding. Breastfeeding, especially the frequent, on-demand nursing common in traditional societies, triggers lactational amenorrhea, which naturally suppresses ovulation and menstruation for months or even years. Strassman calculated that a woman in a traditional society might have only about 100 to 110 periods in her entire lifetime. Compare that to a modern woman in an industrial society, who might experience 450 to 500. The girl in our cave might have seen blood for the first time at 16, become pregnant at 18, and not seen her period again for another 3 years. For her, menstruation wasn't a monthly annoyance, it was a rare, intermittent signal that she was currently open for a new pregnancy. It was a fleeting window of time, not a permanent state of being. This completely changes how we have to think about the products they used. If you only deal with a few days of bleeding every couple of years, you don't need a multi-billion-dollar industry, you just need what's under your feet. That sounds like a nightmare of hygiene, but the reality was actually much more sophisticated than just using what's under your feet. When we ask what ancient women actually used to handle the flow, we run into the archaeologist's curse. Almost everything a prehistoric woman would have used, softened animal hides, dried grasses, or moss, is organic. Organic material rots. It doesn't survive in the soil for 10,000 years. We find stone spearheads and bone needles, but we don't find the prehistoric equivalent of a pad. However, we can use experimental archaeology and ethnographic parallels to make some very educated guesses. One of the leading candidates for the first menstrual product is sphagnum moss. Found throughout the northern hemisphere, sphagnum moss is a biological miracle. It can absorb up to 20 times its own weight in liquid. But more importantly, it is naturally mildly acidic and contains phenolic compounds that inhibit the growth of bacteria. It is, quite literally, a sterile, highly absorbent, disposable pad provided by nature. During World War I, when cotton supplies ran low, nurses actually returned to using sphagnum moss for surgical dressings because it was more effective at preventing infection than the mass-produced bandages of the time. If it worked for a shrapnel wound in 1917, it certainly worked for a teenager in a cave 15,000 years ago. Other cultures used what was local: softened cedar bark in the Pacific Northwest, sea sponges in the Mediterranean, or even rabbit skins, which were prized for their incredible softness and warmth. These women weren't suffering through a lack of products. They were utilizing a deep, ancestral knowledge of the botanical and biological world around them. Yet, despite this practical ingenuity, the transition from a practical biological event to a medicalized mystery began the moment humans started writing things down. As we move out of prehistory and into the light of the first civilizations, we see the first attempts to turn menstruation into a formal science. The ancient Egyptians, for all their talk of mummies and pyramids, were shockingly advanced in their understanding of women's health. The Kahan gynecological papyrus, dating to roughly 1800 BCE, is the oldest known medical text in existence, and it is entirely devoted to women's health. It doesn't treat the period as a curse or a mystery, it treats it as a diagnostic tool. The Egyptian physicians looked at the regularity and color of the flow to determine the health of the entire body. In the Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE, we find specific prescriptions for menstrual issues. They suggested using a mix of lint, honey, and crushed acacia spikes to manage flow or even as a form of early contraception. While the idea of honey and acacia sounds strange today, modern chemistry has shown that fermented acacia produces lactic acid, which is a potent spermicide. These weren't just random folk remedies. These were the results of thousands of years of trial and error, documented on expensive papyrus scrolls. For an Egyptian woman, her first period was likely a moment of transition into a highly regulated medical world where her health was tracked with the same precision as the flooding of the Nile. Contrary to that Egyptian pragmatism, however, the classical world of Greece and Rome decided to make things significantly weirder. By the time we reach the era of the great Greek physicians like Hippocrates, the pragmatic view of periods began to warp into something more clinical and, frankly, more bizarre. Hippocrates believed that women were porous, and that they accumulated excess humors that had to be drained away. To him, the period was a necessary venting of the body's toxins. If a woman didn't bleed enough, he believed the blood would migrate to her heart or brain and cause hysteria. This was the birth of the wandering womb theory, the idea that the uterus was a semi-independent animal that moved around the body causing trouble if it wasn't kept busy with pregnancy or regular bleeding. By the 1st century CE, the Roman physician Soranus of Ephesus, who is often called the father of gynecology, wrote a 4-volume treatise titled Gynecology that remained the gold standard for over 1,000 years. Soranus was a radical in his own way. He actually argued against some of the more insane myths of his time. He was one of the first to suggest that women should actually rest and avoid heavy labor during their periods, and he recommended using soft wool or lint as absorbent material. But even Soranus couldn't stop the tide of superstition that was beginning to rise. While the medical elites were debating humors and wool, the general public was beginning to view the menstruating woman as a source of almost supernatural power, and not the good kind. Now, you might think that having supernatural power sounds like a promotion, but the reality was more like a social prison. This is where we see the birth of the menstrual taboo, a cultural shift that would haunt women for the next 2,000 years. The most famous example of this comes from Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist who wrote Natural History in 77 CE. Pliny was a smart man, but when it came to periods, he went off the deep end. He wrote with absolute confidence that a menstruating woman could turn new wine sour, make crops wither, kill bees in their hives, and even rust iron. He claimed that if a woman in her period sat under a tree, the fruit would fall off prematurely, and if she looked in a mirror, the polish would fade forever. This wasn't just one man's opinion, it was a reflection of a growing cultural anxiety. As societies became more patriarchal and more urbanized, the once natural biological cycle of the cave was rebranded as something unclean. This transition is visible in the evolution of religious texts. In the Hebrew Bible, specifically the book of Leviticus, the laws of Niddah established that a woman was ritually impure during her period and for 7 days afterward. Anyone or anything she touched became unclean. This wasn't necessarily about hygiene. The Romans and Israelites were actually quite obsessed with bathing. It was about social control. By labeling a fundamental biological process as impure, you could effectively remove women from the public sphere for 1/4 of their adult lives. The girl in the cave had a ritual. The woman in the Roman city had a restriction. But before you assume that every ancient woman was living in a state of Pliny-induced terror, the archaeological record suggests that the taboo was often a top-down rule that common people frequently ignored. While the elite men were writing about withered crops and rusted iron, the average woman was just trying to get through her day. We see evidence of this in the Great Silence of the Middle Ages. In the medieval period, there is almost no written record of how women handled their periods. It was a private matter, which in historical terms usually means it was a woman's matter that men didn't think was worth the ink. But we know from court records and household accounts that rags were the universal standard. The term on the rag isn't just a modern idiom. It is a literal description of how nearly every woman in history managed her cycle. They used clouts, strips of linen or hemp that were folded, used, washed, and reused for years. In fact, a woman's clouts were often part of her dowry or her inheritance. They were valuable property. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't have the luxury of sitting in a menstrual hut for a week. You had cows to milk, bread to bake, and fields to weed. The biological reality of the period had to be integrated into a life of grueling physical labor. There is even some evidence that women in the Middle Ages simply free-bled into their shifts or chemises, long, linen undergarments that were easy to wash and bleach in the sun. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't pure, and it certainly wasn't what Pliny the Elder would have approved of, but it was the reality for 99% of the female population for over a millennium. However, the truly shocking part of this story isn't how ancient it is, but how modern the solution actually turned out to be. We tend to think of history as a slow, steady climb toward progress, but in the world of menstrual health, we spent about 2,000 years standing perfectly still. Between the wool recommended by Soranus in 100 CE and the linen rags of 1800 CE, almost nothing changed. The first major leap forward didn't come from a doctor's office or a laboratory, it came from the mud and blood of the trenches in World War I. In 1914, a company called Kimberly-Clark developed a material called cellucotton, a creped wadding made from wood pulp. It was 5 times more absorbent than cotton and significantly cheaper to produce. It was intended for surgical dressings to treat the horrific wounds of the Great War. But the Red Cross nurses on the front lines quickly realized that cellucotton was far more effective than the cumbersome, unhygienic cloth rags they had been using for their own cycles. When the war ended, Kimberly-Clark was left with a massive surplus of cellucotton and a new idea. In 1920, they launched Kotex, the first commercially successful disposable pad. But there was a problem. Victorian-era shame was still so powerful that many stores refused to stock it, and many newspapers refused to advertise it. Even the name Kotex, a combination of cotton and texture, was designed to be a code word so women wouldn't have to say what they were buying. It took another decade, and the invention of the modern applicator tampon by Dr. Earl Haas in 1931, for the industry to truly take hold. For 190,000 years, women handled their periods with moss, wool, and rags. In just the last 100 years, the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, we have moved into an era where the biological reality of the period is almost entirely hidden behind a multi-billion-dollar wall of plastic and secrecy. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all. We might have the best technology in history, but we might have the worst understanding of the biological message the period is sending. We have spent so much time trying to solve the period that we have forgotten it is a fuel gauge. Today, we see a disturbing trend known as the secular trend in menarche. In the United States, the average age of the first period is dropping again, with some girls starting as early as 9 or 10. Scientists believe this is due to a combination of things: increased body fat from processed diets, environmental endocrine disruptors, and even the psychological stress of modern life. Unlike our girl in the cave, whose body waited until she was strong and stable enough to support a life, modern bodies are being tricked into starting the process before the mind or the social structure is ready for it. We look back at the girl in the cave and pity her because she had to use moss and huddle by a fire, but her body was in perfect sync with her environment. Her period was a hard-won trophy of health and survival. She knew something we have spent a century trying to forget, that blood isn't just a waste product, and it isn't a curse. It is a metabolic report card. It is the sign that the body has done the impossible. It has found enough energy in a frozen, hostile world to dream of a future. When she saw that stain on her bison hide, she didn't just see a mess. She saw the proof that she had survived the winter. But if you think that means we've moved past the danger of that prehistoric cave, you're missing the point of why this history matters. For nearly all of human existence, menstruation was a public, communal fact of life, marked by shared knowledge and natural materials. We traded that communal knowledge for the privacy of a plastic wrapper, and in the process, we let the taboo win. We've medicalized it, marketed it, and hidden it so well that many people today are just as confused by the sight of blood as a teenager 10,000 years ago, except we don't have the excuse of living in the Stone Age. We have more information than any humans who have ever lived, yet we are still fighting the same battle against the silence that Pliny the Elder started 2,000 years ago. The girl in the cave eventually stood up from the fire. She reached into a small leather pouch and pulled out a handful of that dried, gray-green sphagnum moss. She knew which patch of the bog it came from. She knew how long it had been dried in the sun. She knew that her mother and her grandmother had used the same moss from the same bog for 10,000 years. She wasn't alone. She was part of a chain of survival that stretched back to the beginning of time. Today, we are the first generation to break that chain, to replace that deep botanical knowledge with a buy-and-discard cycle that we barely understand. We think we are more advanced, but we are often more isolated. So, I have a question for you. If the supply chains stopped tomorrow, if the store shelves went empty and the plastic wrappers disappeared, how many of us would actually know how to handle what our bodies have been doing for 1,000,000 years? Would you know which moss to pick? Would you know how to stitch a clout? Or have we become so civilized, that we've lost the very skills that kept our ancestors alive through the ice. Let me know in the comments if you've ever looked into the history of your own health, or if this changes how you think about the annoyance of a cycle. And if you want more deep dives into the secret history of being human, hit that subscribe button. We're going down a lot more rabbit holes like this one. Because at the end of the day, we are still that same girl by the fire. We are still huddling in the dark, trying to make sense of a body that is far older and far smarter than the world we've built for it. We can pretend the blood isn't there, we can wrap it in plastic and hide it in the trash, but the biology doesn't care about our shame. It only cares about survival. It is the same warm dampness, the same dark stain, and the same chilling reality that has governed our species since the first frost. That 15,000-year-old girl in the cave didn't have a choice. She had to look at the blood and find a way to keep moving. We have the luxury of looking away, but that doesn't mean the lions aren't still out there, circling the fire, waiting for us to forget who we are. In the end, the blood on that bison hide wasn't a wound. It was a countdown. And the clock is still ticking.